Let's talk about the difference between limerence and stalking. Hi, my name is Dr. Natalie Jones. I am a licensed mental health professional, and I have been working with victims and perpetrators of abuse and violence. And I want to take some time to answer some of my commenters' questions here. It says, hi, Dr. Jones. I'm a huge fan of your videos. I watched one where you discussed stalking. Will you do a video on the difference between stalking and limerence? So limerence is mostly imagination based, and it's essentially an intense infatuation where it's obsessive thoughts and fantasies, an intense longing about a person where they don't necessarily reciprocate. You're sort of constantly thinking about that person, imagining a life together, all of this sorts of stuff, just sort of, it's like a constant sort of fantasy and a daydream in your mind. So I would say limerence is more imagination based and stalking is much more physical based. So stalking is like pursuing, approaching a person, harassing, and obsessive attention, and even following a person. With what I've noticed, and I've worked with a number of people who've done a lot of bad things over the years. Limerence is more, both are, stalking is also more of a parasocial relationship. Not always. Sometimes people can have a relationship with a person. So for example, where I've talked about mothers who stalk their children, or fathers who stalk their children as well. Maybe children who don't have, who no longer have contact, or also children who don't conform to norms where their parents have put in place with them in really strict and rigid cultures. So they may be stalked by their parents, who maybe want to get them to comply, or maybe even want to harm them in a lot of cases, to force compliance, or as punishment or retribution for not complying. I think with limerence too, I think limerence, it's more of a person that you don't necessarily have a relationship with, but I would also even go as far to say is a person that maybe you've had contact with, but don't necessarily have that with anymore. When I worked in corrections, a lot of the people that I would work with would have limerence, these sort of fantasies, especially if they were child predators, which is why, I don't agree with children being on TV or social media. They would have, limerent fantasies about, getting with children that they saw on television, or getting with children of maybe someone who brought their children, or had their children in visiting, or, just some sort of variation of that, right? Whereas, and other people's, and this isn't quite limerence, but I feel like it's a variation of that, where people had actually harmed someone, meaning that, and trigger warning, where they had actually raped someone, where they had actually, physically abused or even murdered somebody, and one of the things I used to get on these guys about would be where they would continue fantasizing about their victim after the fact, and so they would sort of have these, they would like, they may write songs, they may draw, their fantasy, they may, write poetry, or these letters, or things like love letters and things like that, that they were never, that they're never going to send. So those would be examples of things that they would do when they're sort of fantasizing about people whom they've already harmed. So that would be one thing versus like stalking is actually physical. So that's like again, like there's like a typically but typically there's always like a progression of like trying to get closer and closer, or wanting to know, being obsessed with knowing this person's whereabouts, confronting them and things like that, wanting to harass. So there's a lot of people that I've worked with in prison that have like permanent restraining orders, for example. So that's permanent restraining order is really hard to come by. So when you see someone who's had that, know that they've really done some stuff, okay, to warrant that, especially depending on what county they get it out of. Where a person is, they're calling up someone, they're making criminal threats, they're coming by unannounced, they're bashing out your windows, they're terrorizing and sort of, they're doing all of these things. They are getting into your alarm system, they're hacking your Wi-Fi, they're being intrusive in many parts of your life, and stripping away from your livelihood. And there's often this progression of violent, even if it's sort of quiet violence, there's more of this progression, but it's actually intrusive on this person's life. And one of the things that I will say about working with stalkers is, one, they don't ever stop stalking. So there's lots of people, especially men that I've worked with in prison, that have a stalking history that continue to do so. In fact, even with me as their clinician, they would continue to stalk. Some of these guys are pretty relentless, but also they still try to keep up with the person that they had a history of stalking or being abusive to outside of prison. So these are people that have strong emotions such as anger and rage tied to their victim, and often feel like like they need to get them back, especially if they were in a romantic relationship. Like there's this feeling of like retribution or revenge, where it's like, and I've known people that have been 20, 30, 40 years down, and it's just like it happened yesterday, and they're like, I'm thinking about breaking that permanent restraining order because I want to call and do some serious damage to this person, and I think about doing that all day, every day. Like, guys just will not let that go, and it's serious and it's intense. I cannot tell you, I cannot tell you how many people I've worked with, and I can do further exploration of anger and rage if you guys want that. It says there's some serious stuff of people who hang on to those feelings of wanting to kill, harm, or abuse someone like that. But I also think, both of these are a type of delusions, even though it's not necessarily in the DSM, I think outside of the box, I think both of these are can be fixated delusions. Limerence, sometimes people can come out of that, sometimes not. Sometimes they stay limerent, but a lot of times people can come out of that, hopefully, and sort of move on. But, I do think both of these are fixed delusions. Both of these people tend to stay inside of their heads. And again, I go back to, like, I feel like there's an in-between fantasy where people just sort of visualize, harming their victim over again. So I feel like that's more on the side of, it's like a mix between the two. I think it's one of the reasons why killers often go back to the scene of the crime, and they masturbate, or they get off on reliving, the actions of what they've done to their victims. Is because of that fantasy part. Always be wary of people who, especially grown adults, who say that they have that they're very imaginative, even if they, I always sort of keep that back in the back of my mind, because these folks typically live inside of their head a lot. But this is a great question. Like, follow, and share. Thanks so much for asking.